It was our 10th anniversary, and we thought camping would be a great way to celebrate. Just the two of us and our dog. There's a big national park with camping areas near our home. Less than an hour's drive away, so we decided to head there. The park is a huge forest filled with tall trees, quiet trails, and clear lakes. There are small ponds scattered around and plenty of camping spots for visitors. It's a favorite place for people to visit during summer, with families, hikers, and campers filling the area. But since it was late September and the weather was chilly, the park felt quieter. We still saw a few people here and there, but it was peaceful compared to the busy summer months. There was a long path that went around the lake near our camp, so we followed it. The lake was small, and there was another camping site on the other side. From our camp, they could see that site, and from there they could see us too. The two campsites were almost across from each other. But when we walked past the other camp, we saw a man there alone. He was just standing and catching us. When we said hello, he didn't answer. He looked about the same age as us, maybe in his late 20s. I thought he might just be shy or a bit unusual. He had a small tent set up and some things scattered around, so it seemed like he had been there for a while. After some time, we made it back to our camp and decided to set up our tent before it got too dark. Once the tent was ready, we cooked some food over the fire. Then out of nowhere, our dog started barking like crazy. She was tied to a long wire attached to a tree, and her barking was loud and sharp. At first, we tried to calm her down, thinking she might be overreacting. But then we realized she wasn't just barking for no reason. The sound of rustling came from the woods nearby, and the feeling of something watching us was hard to ignore. Whatever it was close. I mean, too close. By then, it had been dark for hours. I put the dog on a leash while my husband started, looking around with his bright headlamp. Our dog kept barking nonstop. We were confused and thought it might be some animal, like a bear or a moose. But we couldn't understand why it wasn't afraid of us or why it didn't leave. My husband decided to check the path that led to the other camp. When he reached the path, which was less than 10 meters from our camp, he saw something on the ground. I told him to check it out, and I followed with our dog. He stopped, looked at me, and said, "It's a person lying on the ground." My first thought was that they might be hurt or lifeless. The person was lying face down, not moving at all. We called out, "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Suddenly they stood up without saying a word. It turned out it was the man from the other camp. He looked very shaken and was clearly scared of our dog. He quickly told me not to let her near him, and I see he was on edge. At that moment, I felt a little relieved, thinking it wasn't some huge, dangerous bear that might attack us. But soon I realized that this man might have been even more frightening than any bear. After he stood up, he walked right over to our campfire, sat down without saying anything, and just stared at the flames. The tension in the air grew thick. My husband, still trying to understand what was going on, asked him several times why he was walking alone in the dark forest without any light. He didn't answer us. We tried to lighten the mood by laughing a little and telling him how we thought he was a bear or something. But he didn't even smile. He just stared at the fire, looking annoyed. We noticed his right leg was soaking wet, probably from stepping off the path and getting it in the lake while walking to our camp. He stayed with us for about 30 minutes house, hardly saying anything. It was clear he was keeping an eye on our dog, looking around to see where she was all the time. I also saw a knife hanging from his belt. I figured it wasn't that strange since he was out in the woods, but it still made me uneasy. Every few minutes, he would quietly put his hand in his pocket, just enough to peek at whatever was inside. It reminded me of when someone checks the time on their phone without taking it out of their pocket. But it wasn't a phone he had there. Then finally, after what felt like forever, he stood up again, mumbled something about going back to his own camp, and turned to leave without another word. He never explained why he came to our camp or why he was following us in the dark. I turned to my husband and said there was no way I was going to sleep in that tent. It felt like the biggest no ever. My husband agreed with me. He said the man might come back while we were sleeping. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. So my husband started packing up our things. Thankfully, our car was close by. I stayed near the camp, guarding it, shining the light around to see if the man was coming back. Just as we were almost done getting everything into the car, I saw a quick flash of light on the path between his camp and ours. It was him. He was coming back. Maybe he thought we had gone to sleep because he couldn't see our campfire anymore. My stomach dropped, and without saying a word, we quickly jumped into the car. I looked behind us as we drove off, making sure he wasn't following. We left as fast as we could. I'm not sure if we overreacted, but I had such a bad feeling about him. Who would walk through the dark, wet forest alone just to watch strangers? What would he have done if our dog hadn't heard him? What were his intentions? Maybe he planned to hurt us while we were sleeping. I don't know, and I didn't want to stay there to find out. I'm just glad we had our dog with us. She might have saved our lives. I think people are the scariest thing you can find at night when you're camping. This happened to me a while back when I went on another solo camping trip. I enjoy camping by myself because being in the middle of the wilderness feels peaceful and clears my mind. It's always been a way for me to relax. I picked a trail, packed my camping gear, brought some snacks, and after double-checking everything, I loaded it all into my truck and set off. I find a nice open clearing that looks perfect for camping and decide to set up there. The spot is surrounded by tall trees with soft grass covering the ground. I'm really tired after hiking all day, but I push through and set up my tent at the southern edge of the clearing, right near the tree line. Once the tent is ready, I gather some dry wood and manage to start a small fire. Then I unpack some food and roast a few hot dogs over the fire. Then suddenly I notice a faint noise coming from the distance. At first I think it's just part of the usual forest sounds, as it reminds me of an animal. Maybe a deer struggling to walk as if one of its legs is hurt. I felt sorry for the poor animal, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't go check on it or help it. I decided not to think about it anymore and went back to eating my food. After finishing my meal, I put out the fire carefully to make sure it wouldn't start again. Then I crawled into my tent and got into my sleeping bag. Even though I was tired and feeling calm, I couldn't fall asleep right away. I pulled out a book I had packed and started reading it, using the small lamp I brought to light up the pages. Hours passed and I heard the same sound again, but this time it was much closer. It was coming from the opposite side of the clearing. I stopped reading, put my book down, and listened carefully. The sound was getting louder as the animal moved across the clearing toward my tent. Now, it didn't just sound like slow steps. It was loud, and it seemed like the hooves were being slammed into the ground. After each step, there was a dragging noise, like the deer was pulling something heavy behind it. The sound got closer and seemed to stop in what I guessed was the middle of the clearing. Then everything went completely silent. I couldn't hear breathing or even the faintest sound from whatever was out there. I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The clearing stretched out before me, quiet and dark, with the trees standing tall and still around it. My eyes scanned the area, but there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint outline of trees under the dim starlight. I stared for a while, trying to make sense of it. Where had the noise come from? Why had it stopped? Feeling uneasy, I zipped the tent back up and sat inside, straining to hear anything unusual. But there was nothing. I reminded myself that the woods often have strange noises that don't mean anything dangerous. Animals move around, branches fall, and sounds carry in odd ways. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head and told myself I was safe. I stayed alert for a while longer, hoping to hear something that would explain it. But eventually I decided to stop worrying and focus on resting. I was starting to fall asleep when I suddenly heard men laughing in the distance to my right. Then I heard women laughing and the sound of sticks snapping far off to my left. Now wide awake, I sat up, wondering if I was really hearing this or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me because I was half asleep. But then I heard more faint laughter coming from different directions. It sounded like all kinds of voices. Old men, old women, even children. The laughter sounded strange, and the way it echoed around the forest made me feel uneasy. I was deep in the woods, far away from other people, and the noise earlier had already set off alarms in my head. Something about the timing, the voices, and the way the laughter carried through the trees told me this wasn't just a family out for a walk. But then I noticed something even more unsettling. The usual sounds of the night had stopped. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the wind blowing through the trees. Everything was still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That was when I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't sit there in the silence wondering what was happening. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and fired a shot into the night sky, hoping to make some noise and break the creepy stillness that surrounded me. And I noticed the laughter was gone and the usual forest sounds were back. I started to relax a little, thinking that the shot had scared whoever it was away. Feeling tired and still on edge, I sat down and eventually fell asleep. Then after a while, I woke up in a cold sweat feeling anxious and realized it was still dark outside. As soon as I woke up, I heard two people whispering not far from my tent. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying, but I heard something about being lost. I felt a rush of unease and shouted, "Hey, who's there?" The voices immediately stopped. The silence felt heavy, so I called out again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Then suddenly, without warning, a massive burst of fire shot up from the middle of the clearing like a flamethrower. The flames lit up the entire area, and for a split second, I saw several dark shapes of people standing around, frozen in place. Without looking around, I got up and ran out of my tent. Turning left and heading back toward the trail, I hiked all the way through the night, only stopping when the sun started to rise. I kept my head turned over my shoulder the whole time, but I never heard anyone following me, and I didn't see anyone or anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. After that night, I lost all the enjoyment I had for camping alone. It felt like I left more than just my gear behind in the woods. My friends and I went camping to celebrate my birthday, but on the second day, something really unexpected happened. To explain, we were at the edge of a field, shaped like a peninsula surrounded by woods on three sides. We were cooking over the campfire and playing Pitbull songs loudly since there was a concert nearby that we couldn't attend. Then we heard what we later learned was the cry of a baby coyote. We copied the sound because we thought, why not? But then it started coming closer very quickly, so we used flashlights trying to see its eyes in the dark, but saw nothing, even when we pointed the light straight at the noise. We aimed the lights at the open field and the woods around it in case it came out. The sound stopped, so we thought it got scared and played Pitbull again. But just 5 seconds later, the sound started again, but this time from the other side of the field. We were scared, so we quickly got in the car and drove to my house, which was only half a mile away. We wanted to grab some things for protection, like a baseball bat, because we thought it might just be a raccoon or a lone coyote. But then we figured those animals aren't too hard to handle if they got too close. While we were at the house, one of my friends, who is very spiritual, said they had a bad feeling about the situation. So we also grabbed a sage stick, a blessed rosary, hoping it would help in case something unusual was going on. As we got back to the field, my few spiritual friends, and even me, felt very off, and I was extremely nauseous. So as we parked my car, we said to secure food and grab essentials in order to leave. We secured most of the food and stayed in groups in case it was a predatory animal. The noise started circling again, and as we got the last of the essentials from the campsite and began to get back in the car, it started up again directly behind the tent. The last person finally got in the car, and just as we were about to leave, another friend and I both saw something moving behind the tent. It looked like a misty, shadowy shape. It was walking on two legs, and at first I thought I was just seeing smoke or something strange in the air. But when we got back to my house, my other friend, who had also seen it, told me they saw the exact same thing. I really didn't want to stick around any longer, so as soon as everyone was safely in the car, I floored it out of the field, driving as fast as I could to get away from there. As soon as we pulled into my driveway, the noise started again. But this time it was on the other side of my house, far from the field. We were so scared. We just left half of our things in the car. My 3 spiritual friends used sage to cleanse the house, making sure to do all the windows and doors especially. My cat wouldn't come inside until we finished using the sage. Then it just stood by the door staring at it. Now it's the next day, and we're all really terrified. A deer keeps standing across the road staring into my windows. We went back to take down the campsite, and none of the food had been touched. So it couldn't have been a raccoon or coyotes. I've never been very spiritual before, But if this is something supernatural or a dangerous being, I want to protect myself and my family. When I was in second grade, my best friend Celia started sharing stories about odd things happening in her house. She seemed really worried, and I could tell something was bothering her. Then one day she showed me a small hole in the wall of her unfinished basement. The walls in the basement were made of bricks or cinder blocks, and the hole was forming in the mortar between them. After a while, when we were in 4th or 5th grade, the hole had grown much bigger, and by then we could fit most of our arms inside it. But when we put our arms into the hole, we couldn't feel the end of it. It was strange because the hole kept getting deeper, but didn't get much wider. Around this time, Celia told me she started hearing voices in her basement, and she believed the sounds were coming from the hole, even though I never heard anything when I visited her house. But since we were only 10 years old, I believed her completely. We often had sleepovers on weekends, and that's when I noticed all the creepy things about her house. Her family was a bit unusual because they had so many animals. They had at least 6 cats and dogs, along with rabbits, birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish, and more. Around the time, her cats and dogs would sometimes go missing, and later we'd find them in the basement, standing right in front of the hole. For as long as I knew Celia and her animals, they never liked going into the basement. This started to really frighten us. Celia told me she thought something was living inside the walls and could move around her house, using the hole as a way to come out. I believed her, but I hadn't seen enough to feel as scared as she was. At school, Celia was always nervous and stressed. The teachers and other classmates noticed and were very worried about her. It felt like her parents didn't care or didn't believe her. A lot of people thought she was just nervous because her older sister had gone away to college. Now here's where things got really creepy. I was staying over at her house during the Christmas holiday. One thing to know about Celia's room is that she had a big collection of stuffed animals in all shapes and sizes, which made sense since her family loved animals so much. On the first night of my stay, we slept in her bed. When we woke up the next morning, we saw something strange. All of her stuffed animals, which were usually scattered around the room, had been neatly stacked in a pile about 4 feet high. Every stuffed animal was facing us, staring right at us. I didn't think then, and I still don't believe now, that Celia or anyone else could have moved all those toys. I've always been a very light sleeper, and some of the stuffed animals were on top of a big wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia thought was living in the walls must have done this. We carefully put all the animals back in place and didn't tell her parents. I wish we had now. Since I was staying for the whole weekend, we went to sleep again in her bed that night. Then we woke up around the same time when it was still dark outside. It must have still been night. We heard a very low creaking sound coming from under us. We knew it was the wooden floor under her bed. Just like in a horror movie, and maybe because we were only 10, we thought it would be a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look under. As soon as we did, we saw and heard one of the floorboards slam come back down. We quickly pulled our heads back up, hugged each other, and cried. I have never been so scared in my life. The next morning, I called my parents and asked them to take me home right away. I refused to ever go back to Celia's house because I was too afraid. Things only got worse for her at school and at home. I don't remember if I ever asked her about what was happening in her house again. Maybe I didn't because I was too scared and we were so young. I only saw Celia twice after that, and it was over 10 years ago. I've never heard from her since, but I've always wondered what happened to her, especially since I know her family still lives in that house today. After so many years, I still remember those moments clearly, and my theory is that there was a man or a group of people secretly living in the walls of her house, watching everything that happened. The hole in the wall was their way of spying on us and listening to what was going on in the basement. And when no one was in the basement, they could slip out unnoticed. As for the stuffed animals, I believe they must have been moved by someone who was deeply disturbed, someone with a twisted knee to scare us or mess with her. It was like they enjoyed seeing how much fear they could cause. The next night, the floorboard noise might have been to see if we were asleep. Since I only saw one board move, there's no way that was how they got into the room. They probably had several spots to watch us, so they knew when to move around the house. In the summer of 2010, when I was starting my teenage years, my family went on a trip to a nice hotel in the city. I don't remember why we went, but I do remember that some family friends came too and stayed in nearby rooms. I never asked my parents about the reason, but it doesn't matter for the story. Now, I should say that I get scared easily and always have. I'm a skinny, fragile kid, so I get nervous pretty easily, even now. But this time, it wasn't just me getting scared for no reason, like usual. Anyway, so the hotel had an unusual design. Like the lobby was on the 4th floor, not the 1st floor, which felt odd to me. So to get to the lobby, you had to take the elevator, and you couldn't reach there using the stairs, which would have been good to know before everything else happened. The hotel was built in a square shape. Each floor had a balcony where you could look down into the lobby and cafe area. This meant that if you were walking to your room, anyone on your floor could see you just by stepping out of their room and looking around. I was always scared I might fall over the balcony and drop 8 floors, but the railings were high enough that I didn't worry too much. The first couple of days were fun. My friends and I played cards all day or watched whatever was on TV. And at night, we walked around the hotel halls and told ghost stories. But on the 3rd day, though, things got weird. I woke up to loud screaming outside my door. Because of the hotel's design, sounds from the lobby could echo all the way to the top floors. I stepped outside to see what was going on and looked over the balcony. Down below, I saw a girl on the ground with eggs and milk spilled all around her. People were rushing to help her. And I heard some of them saying to call Benihim. It looked like the girl was unconscious. Maybe she had fainted. I looked around the lobby and saw my family and a few friends eating breakfast, watching what was happening, so I decided to go down to join them and find out what was going on. The elevator was on the other side of my floor, so I used the stairs near my room. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, so I only needed to go down about 4 flights. It wasn't a big deal. I started going down, looking for the number 4 on the wall, or the letter L for the lobby. I passed the 5th floor and kept going. But after a couple more flights, I noticed there was no door for the 4th floor. There wasn't a door for the 3rd or 2nd floor either. At this point, I probably should have gone back, but I kept going because I was tired and didn't want to go back up. I saw some strange side hallways that led to dark areas with pipes and wires. I felt curious but decided not to check them out. Soon I reached the bottom floor. It was a cold, dimly lit room with cinder block walls and concrete floors. In front of me there was a pair of double doors. I paused for a moment but figured this was just another way to the lobby. So I opened the doors and went in. Behind them was a huge warehouse-like room, about the size of a small basketball stadium. The only light came from the stairwell behind me, so I couldn't see much inside. There were stairs stacked and covered in plastic wrap, tables along the wall. And in the distance, I thought I saw boxes piled up against the wall, too. So it was probably the hotel's storage room. I looked around and noticed an elevator at the back of the room. So I started walking toward it. I closed the stairwell door behind me and walked through the dim light. The room felt hot and dusty, like no one had been there for a long time. I pressed the up button, but nothing happened. There was a card swiper next to it. I thought it was probably for employees only. I turned back to the stairwell, doors, and walked past the chairs and tables along the wall. When I reached the door, I tried to open it, but it was locked. Of course, this is when things started to hit me, and I realized I was stuck in the dark, dusty basement of the hotel. I didn't have a phone because my parents said I couldn't get one until I finished middle school, so I couldn't call anyone, and everyone probably thought I was still in my room. So I started to panic, thinking no one would look for me. Now, some parts of the room were brighter, so I looked around in those areas first before checking the darker parts. I found another set of doors, but they were locked too. It felt like hours, but I think only a few minutes passed before I heard a door creak open. It wasn't the stairwell door, but the one I had found. A thin, middle-aged man in a lab coat stepped out of the door. If I had been 21, I would have been really confused about why he was wearing a lab coat in a hotel. But I was only 12, we were 13 at the time, so I felt relieved to see an adult who looked smart. I approached him with tears in my eyes, and he looked surprised to see me, just like you'd expect. "What are you doing down? I got lost on my way to the lobby and got locked in here. Do you have a key?" I was shaking, wanting to get out. He didn't answer about the key, but instead said, "I know a way out. Follow me." He started walking towards the stairwell doors, and I followed. We got to the doors and I reached for the handle, but he kept walking. "Isn't it right here?" I asked him. I will never forget the look on his face when I said that. He looked nervous, and even though it was dark, I could see sweat on his forehead and behind his glasses. "No, this way," he said firmly. I kept following him, but now I was nervous too. We passed the stairwell door and were heading to a darker part of the basement, away from the elevators. He looked like he didn't know where he was going as he kept looking around like he was seeing everything for the first time. We turned a corner and started walking toward the boxes, which led to a dead end. I stopped right away, realizing something was very wrong. This guy didn't know where he was going, and he didn't seem to work at the hotel. "Hey, wait, where are we going?" He turned and said, "This way. Just follow me." I knew there were no doors by the boxes, because I had checked there first when I found the stairwell door was locked. I'm thankful for whatever gave me the idea I had next. I started yelling as loud as I could. I yelled so loudly that I gave myself a headache. The man, annoyed and covering his ears, yelled back at me, "What are you doing? Be quiet." But I kept yelling, and I don't even remember how long it lasted. But fortunately, the man snapped and started walking, looking toward me. I ran as fast as I could towards the stairwell doors, hoping they would somehow be open. He didn't run after me. He just walked behind me, calling me names like stupid and other kind compliments. I was about a few feet from the door when someone suddenly came through. My savior, a hotel janitor who had heard my screaming from the stairwell. The janitor asked me who the man was, and I told him I didn't know. I said the man had come in through the door on the other side of the room and pointed to it. The janitor quickly radioed the front desk, telling them he found a child in the basement. The man in the lab coat started arguing with the janitor, saying he was just looking for a bathroom, but the janitor clearly didn't believe him and kept saying things like, "Wait until security gets here and talk to them." I was standing next to him, trying to understand what was happening. My parents' house is right next to a small red house, and our backyard faces the side of that house, which has a wooden deck and 2 big windows. Out in front, there were always at least 3 cars parked in the driveway or on the street, but no one ever seemed to use them. It was strange because in the 10 years I stayed there, I never saw anyone going in or out of the house, not even to check the mail or take out the trash. Then one evening when I was around 12, I was in the backyard and happened to look toward the red house. Through one of the windows, I noticed faint shadows moving on the far wall, almost like people were walking around inside. It caught my attention because it was the only time I ever saw any movement in that house. Then after a while, when my sister moved out, I took her bedroom. It was a big open room in the basement that had been fixed up nicely. The room had a door with an outdoor stairway leading to the backyard, and there was a small window on the door, and my sister had covered it with a Pulp Fiction poster. But when I moved in, I changed the decoration and put up sheer half curtains instead of the poster. The room was set up so that if I was lying on the bed or sitting on the couch, I could see the door right in front of me. When I first started staying in that room, I noticed that sometimes at night, I could hear the sound of leaves crunching in the stairway outside. I thought it was just my cat, who liked to wander around the neighborhood, so I didn't worry about it. But a few weeks later, something happened that made me think differently. So one night when my parents were away for work, my boyfriend and I sitting on the couch and talking. Then all of a sudden he froze and stared at the small window on the door. He didn't say a word, but I could tell something had caught his attention. So I asked him what was wrong, and he said I just saw a camera flash. At first I laughed it off, thinking he was just imagining things. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the strange feeling. So when it was time to sleep, I kept glancing at the small gap between the curtains on the door. The stairwell outside was completely dark since there wasn't a light there. If someone was really standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching, I wouldn't have been able to tell. Then around 3:00 in the morning, I heard the sound of leaves crunching under heavy boots. For some reason, I decided that the best thing to was to handle it myself. Even though I'm only 5 feet 3 inches, I didn't even bother putting on shoes, and opened the door quickly and looked outside. There was no one in the stairway, so I ran up the stairs into the backyard. That's when I saw him, a man, probably in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, wearing one of those mechanic jumpsuits. He was just standing there. He was holding an old, clunky digital camera that looked like it hadn't been used in years. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, frozen. The way he stood there made my skin crawl. It felt like an eternity before I finally found my voice and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" My words startled him, and without saying anything, he spun around and bolted. He ran straight through my backyard toward the red house and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. After that night, I never saw any strange camera flashes or heard the sound of boots in the stairwell again. But the thought still haunts me. How many nights had he been standing there in the shadows, silently watching me? Back in December 2019, I was living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood and I enjoyed the peace and solitude. My only companion was my dog Max, a loyal German Shepherd who had been with me for years. Max was my protector, my friend, and my comfort in the lonely evenings. The nights that month were cold with frost clinging to the windows. It was the cold that seeped into your bones. I often sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV to pass the time. Max had a habit of sleeping by my side, but lately, he had started doing something strange. Every night around 2 a.m., Max would leave my side, go downstairs to the living room and start barking. At first, I thought he was just hearing noises from outside. Maybe raccoons rummaging through garbage or stray cats prowling. But it became a pattern. Every single night at the same time, he would bark at something. He never seemed scared, but he was alert, like he was warning someone or something to stay away. I tried to ignore it. Max would bark for a while and then come back to my room, curling up on his bed like nothing had happened. But the barking made me uneasy. The nights felt colder, the silence in the house heavier, and I started to dread the sound of Max's claws, clicking on the wooden floor as he headed downstairs. One Friday night in cold December, I was in the living room trying to distract myself with the movie. Max was lying at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sounds from the TV. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. right on cue. Max stood up, his ears perked, and walked to the door of the basement. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a low growl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and listened. Max started barking, loud, sharp barks that echoed through the house. He was standing near the basement door, his nose almost pressed against it. His body was tense, his tail stiff. He wasn't barking at nothing. He was focused, like he saw something I couldn't. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and slowly approached the basement door. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy despite the cold. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on me as I opened the door just enough to shine. The flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cluttered basement. Old boxes, broken furniture, and a few tools were scattered around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, quick and fleeting. Moving behind the boxes, I froze. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Could someone have broken in? I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to run, but this was my house. I couldn't just ignore it. Instead of going down alone, I called my friend Luke. Luke was the guy who never hesitated to help, and he was braver than I could ever hope to be. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh or brush it off. He just said he'd be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Max stayed by the basement door, barking and growling occasionally. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight tightly, jumping at every little noise. When Luke arrived, he didn't waste any time. Armed with his own flashlight, he gave me a reassuring nod, and we both headed toward the basement door. Max followed us, his tail wagging slightly now that Luke was here. We stepped into the basement, the wooden stairs creaking under our weight. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing nothing but old junk. But as we moved closer to the corner behind a stack of boxes, we found him. A man. He was crouched on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, trembling. He looked thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. When our lights hit him, he flinched and held up his hands like he was afraid we'd hurt him. "Please," he said, his voice shaking, "don't call the police." "I'm sorry. I'll leave." Luke and I exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. The man started crying, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. He told us he'd been living in the basement for weeks. He wasn't a criminal, he said. He was just homeless. His wife had died earlier that year, and he'd lost everything: his home, his job, his hope. One cold at night, he found my front door ajar and decided to sneak in just to find a place to sleep. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I only came out at night to get food from the kitchen. I'm sorry." His story hit me hard. I couldn't imagine the pain he must have gone through. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I couldn't do it. He wasn't dangerous. He was just a man at the end of his rope. I told him he didn't have to sneak around anymore. Luke and I helped him upstairs, and I gave him some food and a warm blanket. He ate like he hadn't seen a meal in days. He kept apologizing, saying he would leave and never come back. But I couldn't just send him back into the cold. Instead, I gave him some money and drove him to a nearby shelter where he could get help. As I dropped him off, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and thanked me over and over. That night I returned home exhausted but relieved. Max curled up at my feet as I sat on the couch, the house finally quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and how easily our lives could fall apart. Since that night, I always double-checked my doors before bed. But more than that, I've tried to hold on to a little more compassion. Sometimes people just need a little help to find their way again. When I was young, I wanted to prove that I could live on my own. My parents thought I wasn't ready, but I wanted to show them I could handle it. I rented a small apartment through Airbnb. It was newer, clean, and in a good area. At first, everything seemed perfect. I unpacked, set up my things, and began adjusting to living alone. But soon, strange things started happening. I had a toddler, my little son, Adam. He loved playing with his toys and talking a lot. Even though most of his words didn't make sense one day, I heard him laughing and talking in his room. I peeked in, expecting to see him playing with his stuffed animals. Instead, he was sitting on the floor staring at a blank spot in the corner. His words weren't clear, but it sounded like he was having a full conversation. I asked him, "Who are you talking to?" He just pointed to the corner and said, "My dog, Kittle." I didn't think much of it at first. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the next day he started yelling in the same corner. His face was red with anger, as if he was arguing with someone I couldn't see. I couldn't get him to calm down. He kept pointing at the corner, shouting, "Bad, go away." That night I woke up feeling strange. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It felt like a nightmare, but it was too real. When I finally snapped out of it, I looked down at my arms and saw red marks, scratches running along my skin. The next few nights were worse. I would wake up gasping, with more scratches and bruises appearing out of nowhere. I couldn't explain it. During the day, I worked a night shift with my mom in a government building. One night, something happened that I'll never forget. The building had security cameras set up in the parking lot, and employees could watch the footage. While waiting for my shift to start, I glanced at the monitors and froze. There on the screen was a large black shape near my car. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal, not really. It looked vaguely like a dog, but had no clear features. Just a dark, blurry outline. It stayed low to the ground, almost slinking as it moved. I watched it for a while, trying to convince myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the cameras. But then it crept closer to my car, circling it as if it was waiting for me. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to handle things myself to prove I wasn't scared. The next night it happened again. I saw the black figure on the cameras doing the same thing, stalking around my car. It didn't seem to notice the other cars, only mine. When I went home that night, things felt different. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up with scratches. It seemed like the figure had stayed behind at work. But I was wrong. My mom lived out in the countryside with my grandparents. Their house was about 1/4 of a mile down the road from hers, and there was a shortcut through the woods that connected them. If you walked through the woods, it was about half a mile. The path was narrow and overgrown, and you couldn't take a car. It was only for walking. One evening, I decided to visit my mom. The sun was setting as I entered the woods. The air was cool, and the trees cast long shadows over the trail. It felt peaceful at first, but halfway through, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you. The sounds of rustling leaves and snapping twigs seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it, a low growl. It wasn't a normal growl. It was deep, rumbling, and full of anger. My heart started pounding as I turned to look behind me. There it was, the black figure from the parking lot. It stood at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the shadows. It didn't have eyes or a face, but I could feel it staring at me. Its body seemed to ripple like smoke, shifting and moving, even though it stayed in one place. I turned and started walking faster, but the growling grew louder. I could hear its heavy footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. It was following me. I didn't run. I knew if I ran, it would chase me. My chest felt tight, and every part of me screamed to get out of those woods. I kept walking, my legs shaking with every step. And then it let out a sound I'll never forget. A howl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was long, deep, and full of rage. It made the trees around me feel smaller, like they were closing in. I knew in that moment that if it caught me, I wouldn't take it out alive. Somehow I made it to my mom's house. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My mom was startled, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. I just said, "Something's in the woods." She looked at me with wide eyes and said, "I've seen it too." She told me about the black figure she'd seen on the cameras at work. I realized then that it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was, it had followed me home. For weeks, I stayed with my mom, afraid to go back to my apartment. Eventually, scratches stopped and the nightmares faded. When I was in college, I shared a small off-campus apartment with my best friend, Jamie. We were both a little odd, preferring quiet nights and weird adventures over the usual party scene. One cold October night, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was past 2 a.m., and the streets were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. We weren't drunk or anything, just bored and restless, looking for nothing to do. As we wandered past a stretch of dimly lit shops, we saw it, a dog lying in the gutter. It was a large black dog, its fur matted and dull. Its body was stiff, the way animals get after death. There was a dark, greasy smear under its head, and it didn't take much imagination to guess it had been hit by a car. Jamie knelt beside it for a moment, shaking his head. "Poor thing," he muttered. We didn't stay long. The sight was unsettling, and there was nothing we could do. We kept walking, eventually reaching a small park a few blocks away. The swings swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking softly, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows on the pavement. We sat on a bench for a while, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, we decided to head back the way we came. As we approached the stretch of road where we had seen the dog, a car passed by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we saw it again. The same black dog, alive, crossing the street away from us. It moved slowly, almost limping, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the streetlight. Jamie froze mid-step. "Did you see that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. We hurried back to the spot where we had first seen it, expecting to find the body still there, but the gutter was empty. The greasy smear remained dark and glistening, but the dog was gone. We didn't say much as we walked back to our apartment. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was watching us. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself we must have been mistaken. Maybe the dog hadn't been dead after all. Maybe it had been stunned and somehow managed to get up and walk away. But it didn't make sense. Its body had been stiff. It wasn't breathing. That was only the beginning. A few nights later, Jamie was out with a friend, and I was alone in the apartment trying to study. The building was old with thin walls and creaky floors, so I was used to hearing strange noises. But that night it felt different. I kept hearing faint scratching at the window, like claws dragging against the glass. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe a tree branch, but when I looked outside there was nothing there. just the empty street dimly lit by the orange glow of the streetlights. I closed the blinds and tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued, soft but persistent. It wasn't until Jamie came home that it finally stopped. "Anything weird happened while I was out?" he asked, tossing his jacket on the couch. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, nothing." I didn't want to sound crazy, but over the next few weeks the dog started appearing more and more. Jamie and his friend were walking home from a bar one night when they swore it chased them down the street. Another time, I saw it sitting under a streetlight across from our apartment, its eyes reflecting the light in an unnatural way. It didn't move, didn't bark, just sat there watching. We started hearing rumors too. One of our neighbors mentioned seeing a black dog roaming the area late at night. Our RA even left us a note asking to speak with us. When we knocked on her door, she led us back to our apartment without explanation. When we got there, she opened the door, looked around at the mess, pizza boxes, laundry, half-empty cups of coffee, and frowned. "There's no way you're keeping a dog in here, sorry, Jamie," and I exchanged a look. "We don't have a dog," he said slowly. The RA raised an eyebrow. "One of the groundskeepers said they saw a black dog in your window the other night." We didn't argue. What could we say? We just nodded, waited for her to leave, and locked the door behind her. The final straw came one night in November. Jamie and I were both in the apartment sitting on the couch when we heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere just outside the window. My stomach dropped. Jamie stood up, his face pale. "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the window. Slow, he pulled back the blinds just enough to peek outside. He froze, his body stiffening like he'd been turned to stone. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, letting the blinds fall shut, and turned to me. "It's out there," he said, his voice shaking. "It's just standing there staring at the window." We didn't sleep that night. We kept all the lights on and stayed in the living room, jumping at every little sound. By morning, the dog was gone, but the unease lingered. Jamie moved out a few weeks later, claiming he couldn't take the weirdness anymore. I stayed until the end of the semester, but I never felt comfortable in that apartment again. Working at a gas station for the last 2 years, I've seen all kinds of people come through. Some were just passing by, filling up their tanks before they disappeared down the highway. Others, regulars who stopped in often enough that I got to know their stories. But most were strangers, gone as quickly as they came. My shift usually ran from 4 p.m. to midnight, and while it could be boring, it wasn't exactly scary. That changed one Saturday night. The station was mostly empty. It was just after 10 p.m., and I was finishing up some cleaning inside the convenience store. The night was cool, with a light fog beginning to settle over the empty road. Then I heard the distinct sound of a car pulling up to one of the pumps. I looked out through the glass window and saw an old beat-up sedan rolling in. The car looked like it hadn't been taken care of in years. Rust patches covered most of the body, and the headlights flickered like they could go out at any second. The driver was man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with a rough beard and dirty clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken and dark, and his skin had an oily sheen under the dim lights of the station. There was something about him that immediately made my stomach twist. It wasn't that he looked angry or dangerous exactly, just off. He parked his car at pump number 3 and sat there for a moment. I watched him through the window, waiting for him to get out and start pumping gas, but he didn't move. He just stared forward, hands on the steering wheel, his eyes wide and unfocused. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to stay inside the store and wait until he left. But something in my gut told me to go out and see if he needed help. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he was lost. Or maybe I was just overthinking things as usual. I stepped out of the store, the cool night air hitting my face, and walked over to his car. His eyes snapped toward me as I approached, and for a second, I thought I saw something almost like fear flash across his face. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Need any help?" I asked, keeping my distance. He shook his head, not saying a word, and looked away quickly. I didn't like it. His behavior was strange, but I didn't want to push. I turned to head back inside, but as I did, something caught my eye. In the backseat of his car, Partially hidden under a dirty black cloth was a hand, a small hand. At first I thought it was a mannequin or some prop, but something about it looked too real. It was pale with tiny fingers curled loosely like a child's hand. My heart skipped a beat. I took a deep breath and turned back to the man. "Is that your kid in the back?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the fear creeping into my voice. The man's face changed instantly. His eyes hardened, and he glared at me with such intensity that I felt frozen to the spot. "Mind your business," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I wanted to walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront him? Call the police? What if I was overreacting? I nodded slowly and stepped back, pretending to head back inside. "All right," I muttered, though I'm not sure he even heard me. But instead of going back to the store, I circled behind his car, keeping out of his line of sight. I needed to stall him and keep him there long enough for help to arrive. I couldn't just let him drive off with that child, if it even was a child. I walked back toward the front of the store, calling out over my shoulder, "Hey, I think something's wrong with the pump. Might take a few minutes to get it working." He didn't respond. He just kept staring forward, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing holding him together. Once I was inside, I grabbed the phone and dialed the local police. My hands were shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, trying to sound calm but feeling the panic building in my chest. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the station, their lights flashing but their sirens off. As soon as the man saw them, he bolted from his car and sprinted toward the woods behind the station. One of the officers chased after him while the other went to check the car. I watched through the window as they pulled the cloth off the back seat. My stomach turned when saw the boy. He was unconscious, pale but alive. The officer quickly called for an ambulance. Meanwhile, the man hadn't gotten far. The officer tackled him to the ground at the edge of the woods and cuffed him. They dragged him back to the station. His face twisted in anger, but he said nothing. The next few days were a blur of police reports and interviews. The officers told me that the boy had been kidnapped from a mall a few days earlier. His family had been frantically searching for him, and I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't noticed that hand in the back seat. A few days later, the police thanked me, saying I'd probably saved the boy's life. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, the coldness in his eyes when he'd told me to mind my business. It was a cold, rainy night. The night where you'd rather be anywhere else, but stuck working the late shift at a small, rundown gas station on the edge of town. My name's Dan, and I've been working here for just over a year. Nights like these are usually quiet, with only the rain tapping against the windows to keep me company. The station itself was old. Faded yellow tiles covered the floor, and the flickering neon sign outside gave everything a strange, sickly glow. The smell of oil and stale coffee filled the air, as it always did. I hated it. The rain had been coming down for hours, heavy and constant. It made the whole place feel even more isolated, like the world outside was a million miles away. I'd already counted the cash in the register twice, restocked the shelves, and moped the floor. There wasn't much else to do. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me, and I remember leaning against the counter, staring out into the dark, thinking about how dead it was tonight. At around 2 a.m., a car pulled up. The headlights cut through the rain like 2 bright, glaring eyes. It parked right by the front door, unusual for someone just stopping for gas. I didn't recognize the car. The engine rumbled for a second longer than it should have before cutting off, and that gave me an uneasy feeling. I straightened up, waiting for whoever it was to come in. The door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He was tall, soaking wet, and wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. I couldn't see much of him, but his posture seemed tense and rigid. His jeans were ripped and dirty, like he had been out in the rain for hours. "Evening," I muttered, though he didn't respond. Instead, he walked slowly toward the back of the store near the drinks and snacks. Something about him didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that he was dripping wet, or that he hadn't said a word. It was his walk, stiff, deliberate, almost like he was forcing himself to move. I tried not to think too much about it. We got all kinds here, drifters, locals, people just passing through. Still, my eyes kept darting back to him as he wandered between the aisles. He was taking too long to decide outside longer than anyone should for a bottle of soda or a pack of chips. I heard the faint rustle of plastic, but he hadn't picked anything up. I told myself not to worry, but the longer he stayed, the more the pit in my stomach grew. Something he wasn't right. The rain outside pounded harder, the wind whistling through the cracks in the old windows. I wiped the counter with a rag, pretending to stay busy, but my eyes were glued to the back of the store. Then, just when I thought he might leave, he turned sharply and started walking toward me. My heart picked up pace, a dull thudding in my chest. His hands were shoved deep in his hoodie's pockets, and his face was still hidden in shadow. I swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. When he reached the counter, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, rainwater pooling on the floor beneath him. I forced myself to look him in the eye, or at least where I thought his eyes would be. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice a little shaky despite my effort to sound casual. He didn't answer. Instead, his hand emerged from his pocket, and what he placed on the counter made my blood turn cold. A gun. It wasn't a big gun, just a small black revolver, but it might as well have been the size of a cannon for how it made me feel. My throat went dry and I took an instinctive step back. The man finally spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. "Give me the cash," he said, and those 4 words sent a chill down my spine. There was no emotion in his voice, no hesitation. He was calm, too calm for someone holding a gun in a gas station at 2 a.m. I nodded, hands trembling as I opened the register. The clinking of coins and the rustle of bills seemed so loud in the silence that followed. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I just kept my eyes on the money as I pulled out the cash, praying he wouldn't pull the trigger. The seconds stretched out like hours. The storm outside raged on, and all I could hear was the pounding of rain and the pounding of my own heart. I handed him the money, crumpled bills, all we had in the register at this time of night. He took it without a word and stuffed it into his pocket. I thought he would leave then, just take the cash and walk out, but he didn't move. He stood there staring at me, the gun still pointed in my direction. For a moment I thought that was it, that he'd shoot me just to tie up loose ends. My mind raced, thinking about all the stupid things I'd never get to do. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked toward the door. He didn't run. He didn't even hurry. He just walked like nothing had happened. The door swung open with a creak and the cold air rushed in. He stepped out into the rain, the gun wheel in his hand. I stood frozen behind the counter, unable to move until I heard the car door slam and the engine sputter to life. The taillights disappeared into the night, swallowed by the storm. I didn't call the police right away. I couldn't. I just stood there staring at the puddle of water he had left on the floor, trying to process what had just happened. It didn't feel real. None of it did. But the empty cash register and the faint smell of gunpowder told me otherwise. The rain kept falling, but now it sounded different. I had been driving for hours, my eyes dry and heavy from staring at the dark road ahead. The trees lined both sides, bending slightly with the wind. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I hadn't seen another car for miles. My GPS had stopped working a while back, leaving me to guess where I was going. The gas gauge was almost on empty, and I needed to find a station soon. That's when I saw it. The gas station appeared out of nowhere, the neon sign flickering faintly in the distance. It wasn't a modern place. It looked old, like it had been forgotten by time. The sign above the pump said, "Gas and Go," but the lights were dim, casting an eerie glow over the area. I pulled in, grateful to have found somewhere to fill up. There was only one pump that looked like it worked, and even that seemed questionable. I stepped out of the car, the night air colder than I expected. There was no one around, not even a car parked near the convenience store attached to the station. The windows were dark, but a faint light glowed inside. The pump creaked as I lifted the nozzle, and the smell of gasoline hit my nose. As I began filling up, I glanced toward the store. Something about it felt wrong, like it was staring back at me. The wind picked up, rustling the trees behind the station, and I could hear the faintest sound, like a whisper. I told myself it was just the wind. The pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. But when I went to put the nozzle back, the pump handle slipped from my hand, hitting the ground with a loud clang. The noise seemed to echo too long, like it was bouncing off invisible walls. I bent down to pick it up when I saw something move in the reflection of my car window. Just a quick flash of movement behind me near the store. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing. The store sat as still and empty as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive after all. After putting the nozzle back in place, I figured I should at least go inside the store and see if anyone was working. I walked slowly toward the entrance, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The glass door was covered in dust like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I pushed it open, and the little bell above the door jingled softly, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet night. Inside, the store was worse than it looked from the outside. The shelves were half empty, some covered in a thin layer of dust. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. There was a counter at the back, but no one stood behind it. The trash register was old with yellowed buttons, and next to it, a pack of cigarettes lay open as if someone had just left them there. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. No answer. I waited a few seconds, hoping someone would come out from in the back room. Nothing. I moved toward the counter, feeling the weight of the silence press against me. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar. From where I stood, I could see just enough to notice that the darkness behind. The door seemed deeper than the rest of the store. Something about it felt unnatural, like it didn't belong. I stepped closer, staring at that dark doorway. That's when I saw it, a figure just for a split second standing in the doorway. It was too dark to make not any details, but I saw enough to know it wasn't right. Its outline was strange. Too tall and too thin, and its face, there was something wrong with its face. I blinked and the figure was gone, leaving only the blackness behind the door. It cracked away, my breath coming quicker. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard the sound. It was soft at first, like something dragging along the floor. It came from behind me, from that dark doorway. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I shoved the door open and ran back to my car, not looking back. I could still hear that dragging sound behind me, growing louder with each step. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. When the engine roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding out of the station. In the rear-view mirror, I could see the gas station shrinking in the distance. But just before it disappeared, I saw it again, standing in doorway watching me leave. That figure, its face still hidden in shadow. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. The lights of the gas station burned in my memory. That strange, too thin figure standing there like it was waiting for something or someone. I've never been able to shake that night from my mind. I'm a security guard for a mid-sized office building. It's located right in the center of the city. Around here, crime rates are pretty high, so it's not uncommon for businesses to have huge losses from break-ins at night. I usually have a coworker with me, but during this month, I was alone while the company I worked for was training up a new employee. I didn't mind it at all, though. Being alone was more boring and made it harder to stay awake. But having a partner sometimes could get annoying, depending on who it is. Anyway, it was around 2 weeks into this month, when I was patrolling the lot like usual, and noticed a couple guys far off, on the other side of the road. They were standing around in the dark, looking in my direction. I don't know if they were looking at the building or watching me, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. The next time I made my rounds, they were gone. I took a mental note of it, but I didn't think about it too much. The rest of the night was quiet. I got out at 6 a.m. with nothing more to report on. The next couple days were uneventful as well. But then, one night at the end of the week, I made my rounds outside and saw them again. They were in the same spot as last time, standing in the dark and watching me. It made me uncomfortable again. So instead of continuing my rounds, I stayed out on that side of the building. Maybe if they saw that I noticed them, they would leave. I stood out there and walked back and forth for about 5 minutes before the men walked away. As I was out there, I tried to take notes of what they looked like. but there really wasn't much I can make out from that distance. I stayed out for another 10 or 15 minutes after they left, making sure they didn't come back. Then I went back inside. With them gone, I figured now was a good time to head to the break room and take my lunch. It was about 1 a.m. The break room was at the far end of the hallway in the back of the building. I sat at a table and started eating while scrolling on my phone when I suddenly heard a noise. I put my phone down and looked at the door to the hallway. I'd never heard any noises like that before. After a few seconds, I got up and walked over to the doorway. I stood there for a good 30 seconds, waiting to hear anything. But it all seemed so quiet that I figured it must have been nothing. I went back in, I finished my lunch. Afterward, I went to the security office and double-checked that there were no alerts or flags. Everything looked good. Usually this was the time of night where I just sit in my chair and wait around. But something in me felt like going to make another rounds. The noise I heard didn't have me nervous though. I think if anything, I was actually just more curious about what it was and found it as something for me to look for while I was bored. I started my rounds outside, walking around the building. It was quiet, just the ambient sound of the buzzing streetlights. Nobody was out there. I went back inside and started walking through the inside of the building. Usually, unless there was a flag or alert in the system, I wouldn't go checking every inch of the place. I'd just walk up and down the hallway and make sure nothing was off. The hallway was long, though, and was in the shape of an L, so it was more like two long hallways. On one side was the main door, and on the other side, there was a door to a mini stairwell that had an emergency exit door. It was one that was original to the building, so one of those old, heavy metal doors. As far as I knew, it wasn't connected to the security system because of how old it was. To bypass this, the company just put a huge padlock on it and bolt it shut to essentially make it useless. However, when I got to the end of the hallway and looked through the door window into the stairwell, I was in complete disbelief. The padlock was snapped in half, laying on the ground, and the metal door had been forced open. I felt lightheaded as I hurried back to the security office. If someone had broken in, how the hell did they slip past me unnoticed? Surely I would have seen or heard them. I started scanning through the tapes. I got to the point where I was standing outside, watching the two men. After they left, I stayed for a bit to keep watch. During that time, they came around to the back of the building and snapped the locker knockoff, breaking in and going into the workrooms. Disturbingly, they were still inside the building when I came back inside. One of them was just on the other side of a door, literally 2 feet from me as I walked past him and into the break room. While I was in there, one of them bumped into a desk while trying to hide, which was likely the sound I heard. When I went back outside to do my rounds, that's when they made a run for it. On the tapes, it was pretty clear that they both had weapons, either large knives on their belts or possibly even small firearms, which makes me think they were prepared to take me down if it came to that. I called the police and handed over the tapes, but nothing ever came of it. They weren't great quality, and the men had their faces covered. The company claimed several hard drives or files or something were taken, and they seemed pretty worried about it. This day, there's been no more info on the men or their motives. I work night shifts at a hospital, specifically in the ER. I'm the front desk worker that typically checks people in, though we still see a lot of crazy things here. Each night is unpredictable. This night started out quiet. We had a few people come and go, but nothing too big happened. I was mostly sitting at my desk talking to my worker, Amy, about whatever we could think of talking about. Around 2 a.m., Amy went on break to go to the cafeteria, so it was just me at the front counter. Really soon after, like not even a minute after she left, a man came through the front doors. He was wearing a black zip-up hoodie and black jeans. His hair was dark and somewhat long and looked unkempt, like he hadn't showered or maybe had just woken up. He walked up to the counter slowly and had this strange aura about him. It made me feel unsettled. I'm looking for Hannah Smith. I didn't remember the exact name he gave, but it was a woman's name, and as far as I knew, they hadn't been admitted recently. Still, I checked the records, but I saw no one by that name. The man seemed uncomfortable as he waited. I told him there wasn't anyone here by that name, and that he may need to check other hospitals in the area. He awkwardly nodded and walked out. I glanced at the security guard who was standing at the other side of the room, and we both made that eye contact, agreeing that that guy was a little strange. A half hour later, Amy came back. The rest of that shift was quiet and slow. I got out at 04:09 a.m., saying bye to my coworkers and heading out to the parking lot. This wasn't the largest hospital, but the parking lot was really oversized. It was huge, and all the workers were supposed to park in the back to make room for patients closer to the building. As I walked to my car, a weird feeling came over me, and I randomly thought back to that man that came in earlier. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt unsettled again. Maybe it was the eerily quiet parking lot at night. I walked a bit faster, got up to my car and got in. I tossed my bag on the passenger seat and started driving. I lived about 20 minutes away. The roads were long and empty, but throughout that drive, I still couldn't shake the strange feeling. I felt like I was being followed or watched. Yet every time I looked in the mirrors, nobody else was on the road behind me. When I finally got home, I pulled into my driveway and parked, getting out and going in through the front door. I hadn't even taken my shoes off yet. When I heard footsteps sprinting up to the porch, they got right up to the door and immediately shook the handle trying to open it. Thankfully, I always instinctively lock the door every time I open or close it. As soon as they realized it was locked, they stopped. There was a pause before a familiar voice spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, can you please open the door? I need help. Please open the door." It was the creepy guy from the hospital. I didn't respond, and shakily took my phone out and called the cops. Seconds later, the man bolted away. I looked out the peephole and saw him run down the road and disappear in the dark, but confirming it was definitely the same guy with the black hoodie and black jeans. When cops arrived, I was hit with probably the most insane, creepy, and downright horrifying information. The back door to my car in my driveway was open. He had been in the back seat the entire drive home, which explains how he got up to my front door so fast. Even more disturbing is that he was probably hoping I'd park in my garage, which would essentially give him access to my entire house that night. Parking in the driveway probably caught him off guard and likely saved my life that night. They used the footage from the hospital CCTV to identify the man and found him. A few days later, he was some nobody that I'd never met in my life, but he had some strange fixation with me. He had stalked me from outside the hospital for weeks, figuring out which car I drove and probably just trying to find a night that I accidentally left my car unlocked for too long. Even though he was caught, he never admitted to anything and just repeatedly said that he wanted to talk to me. And that was it. This was a while ago, but I haven't heard or seen anything about him since. When I was in my mid-20s, I worked night shifts at a 7-Eleven. I was still doing online school at the time, and I figured most of my shifts would be slow enough for me to get some schoolwork done during my shifts. For the most part, this actually worked out. I'd be the only one there, and it would never really get busy. Whenever someone would come in, I just pushed my laptop aside, and when they left, I'd continue my school stuff. This night, it was very cold and rainy outside, which always made me happy because almost no customers would come in. I had my laptop out and was focused on school for almost 2 hours straight when the front door opened and a man walked in. He looked 30 with a beard and short hair. I put my laptop off to the side and waited for him to come up to the counter. The man looked around the aisles for a minute or two, then walked out, got in his car and left. Not thinking too much about it, I grabbed my laptop and continued about my work. Another 30 minutes passed when out of the corner of my eye, I saw headlights pulling up in front of the store. I looked over and was confused to see the same car that was here earlier. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence, but when the guy got out, it was the same man. This time he walked into the store and came right up to the counter before I could even move my laptop. "Restroom?" he asked. "Oh yeah, it's right over there." I wasn't expecting that question at all. He walked over to the restroom and went in. It was one of those single-person ones, not like a whole room. I couldn't help but think it's a bit odd to come back 30 minutes later to just use the bathroom. There had to be somewhere closer to wherever he was, unless he stayed in the area. For the whole 30 minutes, he possibly could have been back to also grab something that he decided he was excited he needed. I don't know. I waited a couple of minutes and then a couple more, and then it started to get a little unusual.
Honestly, though,
I did not want to be that guy who checks up on him or knocks on the door or... Another 15 minutes passed, so he'd been in there for almost 25 minutes at this point when a police officer pulled into the parking lot. He circled around and slowed down right behind the other guy's car, clearly inspecting it. After a little bit, he stopped his vehicle right behind the car and got out. The officer came into the store and looked around the sales floor, then looked at me and asked if I knew who was the owner of that car outside. The officer looked more than just curious. He looked worried. I pointed at the bathroom and said he'd been in there for a while. The officer went over and didn't hesitate to begin banging on the door. It was clear something was seriously wrong. After a minute of him knocking and yelling, he looked at me and asked if I had a key to the door. I was shaky, but I sifted through the drawer under the counter and found the key, then ran it over to him. He unlocked the door and opened it, gun raised. The room was empty. I couldn't believe it. After getting interrogated for a minute, I assured the cop that he had gone in there and never came out. The officer did a more thorough search and happened to notice the ceiling was accessible. It was one of those ceilings that's made up of panels, where you could just push them out. I guess the man had gotten on top of the sink and was able to haul himself up. The officer called in backup, and within 15 minutes, they found the man hiding inside the ceiling. They got him out and arrested him. As I've been told, the guy was on the run after doing some absolutely horrible things to several random and innocent people. Earlier in the night, they got a description of his car and caught his license on a store camera. The officers made it seem like I was lucky because the past individuals he had harmed were all alone in the middle of the night, either working or just walking around outside. Whether the man was trying to hide in the ceiling because he knew the cops were after him, or he was doing so to try something on me is unclear. Thankfully, he's locked up for good, though.